The 3rd of March, 1943. The Bismarck Sea, north of New Guinea. The Japanese pilot in the cockpit of his fighter had seen every kind of American aircraft in a year and a half of war. He knew the flying fortresses. He knew the torpedo planes. He knew how they came in, high, steady, predictable, the way a bomber is supposed to come. But this machine moved differently, low, almost on the water itself, all but brushing the crests of the waves, twin-engined, squat, without a fortress's grace, and its nose was not like the others, not the familiar glass dome of a navigator, but solid, blind, painted a dull green. Dark holes pocked the cowling. The pilot narrowed his eyes. From that angle he had no time to count them. A bomber skimming the water is a bomber that will miss. Everyone knew it. To put a bomb on a ship you climbed, settled onto a bombing run, opened yourself to the guns. This one crawled along the surface as if it had lost its way. Easy prey. He rocked his wings at his wingman and dropped down to meet it, and only when that solid nose filled his gun sight did the dark holes along the cowling come alive, all at once. Now forget everything the movies ever showed you about bombers. This aircraft was not a bomber, or rather, it was, until someone took an ordinary Mitchell and did to it what its designers never intended and could never have imagined. They called him Pappy, Pops, because at well past 40, he was old enough to father the green lieutenants who were dying around him in droves. Before the war, he was no hero and no theorist of air combat. He flew for a civil airline in the Philippines, carrying passengers and mail. When the Japanese came, his family was left behind in Manila as prisoners, and he ended up in Australia, furious beyond words, and with hands that could fix and rebuild anything that flew. Why does a bomber need a glass nose? In that nose sat a bombardier, aiming from kilometers up against wide areas. Almost no one hit ships from that height. Japanese transports sailed on calmly, while the bombs raised harmless plumes off to the side. So Gunn threw the bombardier out, entirely. He threw out the sight, threw out the glazing, threw out the very idea of bombing from above. In the navigator's place, he began welding a steel plate and cutting machine guns into it. Not 2, not 4, 8 heavy 50 caliber barrels, all facing dead ahead, all firing at once, straight where the nose of the aircraft was pointed. And along the sides of the fuselage, he hung still more in packs, and the total number of guns firing forward climbed past a dozen. Each barrel spits out some 700 to 800 rounds a minute. Add up 8. You get a torrent of several thousand lead projectiles a minute, and all of them converge on a single point ahead. A 50 caliber round is half an inch across, a slug of metal weighing a good ounce and a half, flying faster than 800 meters a second. One of them punches through a ship's hull, and there are thousands a minute into one point. Gunn was not building a bomber to drop its load neatly and go home. He was building a low-flying scythe of fire, a machine that comes in over the water, point blank, and shears everything off a transport's deck in a single burst. Anti-aircraft crews, superstructure, lifeboats, the bridge. And on the same pass, it lays a bomb, not from above, but from the side, skipping it across the water like a flat stone, straight into the hull. And none of this was assembled in a factory, to blueprints from Washington. It was put together in the field workshops of Australia and New Guinea, by the hands of mechanics every bit as angry, under the personal eye of a man whose family sat captive under the very enemy he was now loading these barrels against. The brass first thought him mad, overloaded, overweight, a ruined bomber. Gunn did not listen. He already knew what would come of it. The Japanese did not yet. Now do the arithmetic yourself. Don't take it on faith. Take the numbers and add them up, the way the man who built this machine in a field workshop added them up. One Browning 50 caliber machine gun spits out some 750, even 800 rounds a minute. 8 such barrels in the nose. Multiply it. 6,000 shots a minute, 6,000 pieces of lead, each one flying dead ahead, where the nose of the aircraft is pointed. Now add the side packs on the fuselage, add the top turret firing forward, and the torrent climbs past 8,000 shots a minute. 8,000. 50 caliber is 12.7 millimeters across, a solid chunk of metal weighing about 42 grams. It leaves the barrel at roughly 880 meters a second, nearly 3 times the speed of sound. At half a kilometer, that round still carries enough energy to punch through a steel plate an inch thick, punch through a ship's plating, punch through an engine block, punch through a man, and everything standing behind him. The 8 barrels were set so that their streams converged on a single point ahead, at a distance of about 300 meters. Picture that point in the air. More than 100 rounds pass through it every second. Not scattered, not at random, but tightly grouped into a patch the size of a door. Anything caught in that patch stopped being a whole object and became debris in fractions of a second. And now, the heart of it. Every 5th round in the belt is a tracer. It glows in flight, which means for every visible streak of fire, there are 4 more you cannot see. When 8 barrels opened up at once, hundreds of these glowing threads were flung into the air every second, packed so tightly that the human eye stopped seeing separate tracers. It saw a solid wall. A solid orange forward-flowing wall of fire, and behind every visible thread hid 4 more leaden stingers that no one noticed until it was too late. A Japanese transport is not a tank. Its hull is sheet steel, sometimes a finger thick, sometimes thinner. The anti-aircraft crew on deck stands in the open, shielded by little more than a gunplate. The bridge is glass and thin metal. The boats are wood and canvas. Now run 8,000 shots a minute down that deck from point-blank range at masthead height. In one pass lasting perhaps 10 seconds, more than 1,000 rounds cross the target. The deck turns to a sieve, along with everyone on it. That firepower came at a cost. 8 barrels and the ammunition for them meant hundreds of extra kilograms in the nose of a machine that was never light to begin with. The center of gravity crept forward. The bomb load fell, fuel consumption rose. With prolonged fire, the barrels grew so hot, the nose compartment became a furnace, and a separate ventilation system had to be improvised so the ammunition would not ignite on its own. The recoil of 8 barrels firing together actually slowed the aircraft in flight, shaving off a little speed. But none of it meant a thing next to what this machine did to a target. Until now, the bomber had been a weapon that needed protecting. It was flown in formation, screened by fighters, its crews counting missions the way you count down days to the end of a sentence. Here they took the same airframe, the same engines, the same silhouette, and turned the logic inside out. The machine everyone was used to treating as prey was crammed with barrels to the limit and sent in first, not to hide, not to fend off, to come in point blank and shear away everything in its path. And once you add up all these numbers, 8 barrels, 8,000 shots a minute, 40 grams of lead at 3 times the speed of sound, converging on a single point, you understand why the first Japanese pilot to enter that point never had time to grasp what had happened. Let us go back to that Japanese pilot who rocked his wings at his wingman and dropped down. Until that second, everything in the sky obeyed a single law. The fighter hunts, the bomber runs. A year and a half of war had hammered that law into his spine for good. He went into the attack as a victor before the first shot was fired. He came in high and from the side, by the book, to the place where an ordinary bomber has a blind spot, where the gunners cannot swing their barrels around in time. He was counting on a machine that would dodge, jerk, hose the sky blindly out of fear. He had seen American gunners many times scatter their bursts into empty air in a panic. This pass promised to be just as easy. But the low machine did not flinch. It did not turn, did not dive, did not try to escape. It swung its nose straight onto him, calmly, the way you bring a barrel to bear, not the way you save your own skin. And at that very moment the solid nose, that blind green nose with no bombardier's glass, spat fire from every hole at once, not 2 flashes, not 4. A whole constellation of muzzle flames flared before him simultaneously, and the air between him and that machine stopped being empty. It became solid. A solid orange wall reached out toward him, a wall of glowing tracers packed so tightly that no gap remained between them, and behind every visible thread raced 4 more he could not see at all. He had perhaps half a second to understand. Half a second is less than the time it takes to lift a finger off the trigger, less than the time to bank the machine. He managed neither. The wall reached him. The first rounds went into the engine. Not one, several at once, grouped tight into a single spot. They ripped the cowling open from within. Oil lashed across the canopy, coating it in a black film in an instant. The next tore off the propeller hub, and the blades, which a moment ago had pulled the machine smoothly forward, spun on in a dead, useless circle. Another passed through the cockpit floor a few centimeters from the pilot's legs. The engine seized stone dead. Half-inch projectiles do not make neat little holes. They tear out chunks. They fold thin metal like foil. A line of punctures ran across the wings. The canopy cracked in several places at once, showering the pilot with fragments. The machine that a second and a half ago had been a predator diving on easy prey turned into a piece of falling iron with a stopped heart. The hunter became the prey, not in a pretty metaphor, literally, physically, in 4 seconds. The one who had dived from above with a smile under his mask was now falling toward the water, trailing a black smear of smoke, and the only thing left to him was to find somewhere flat to come down. His wingman, riding higher, saw all of it from above to the end. He saw a single low machine throw out before itself a cone of fire several hundred meters long, a cone through which no aircraft passed intact. And the wingman did the one sensible thing he could do. He did not go to avenge. He did not turn in to attack. He hauled the stick into his gut, climbed away and to the side, away from that wall, and left the low green machine to whoever would be fool enough to repeat the approach. And in the nose compartment of that machine, the gunner lifted his finger off the trigger. The whole encounter had taken him a few seconds. He had fired perhaps a few hundred rounds out of the thousands lying in the belts. There was enough left for a dozen more brave men. And behind that green machine came others, exactly the same, and each carried in its nose the same wall. Now let us raise the stakes. The young pilot who flew into the wall of lead over the Bismarck Sea can still be written off as inexperience. Green, too hasty, didn't look closely. But what will you say about a man with 200 combat sorties behind him, a man who had seen in the sky everything there is to see in this war? These men had not started yesterday. Many had gone through China before Pearl Harbor. They had fought over the Philippines, over Java, over Guadalcanal. Some had brought down 30, 40 enemy aircraft. They flew the Zero, a machine that for the first 2 years of the war was a nightmare for everyone who rose to meet it. Light, nimble, with a range that left the Americans slack-jawed. These pilots considered the sky over the Southwest Pacific their own. And when the tales began reaching them about a twin-engined bomber that supposedly shot fighters down head-on, they laughed. A bomber does not hunt. A bomber carries bombs and fights back when it is cornered. That is how war in the air is built. That is how it has always been. The story of a machine with a solid nose belching a solid wall of fire sounded, to a seasoned ace, like a fairy tale for recruits. Propaganda. A staff invention to lift the spirits of frightened crews. Or, at best, somebody's lucky blind burst, later inflated into legend. A real ace knew the worth of stories like that. He led his flight to intercept an American group running low over the water toward a Japanese convoy. Among the machines, he picked out at once the strange ones, squat, with blind noses, moving right at the surface, the very ones the tales were told about. Excellent. He would show the young ones what is done with fairy tales. He would go in first, head on, by all the rules, and bring down one of these hell machines before everyone's eyes. And then he would see who still believed staff leaflets. A head-on attack on a bomber is a matter of seconds. You race in with a closing speed near 1,000 kilometers an hour, fire a burst, and shoot past before the gunners can catch you. His Zero carried 2 cannon and a pair of machine guns, more than enough for a bomber if you place a burst into the cockpit or the engine. He went into the attack the way he had gone in 200 times before, with a cold head, without a shadow of doubt. All 200 of his earlier passes had rested on one unwritten rule. A bomber has almost nothing up front. 1 or 2 barrels poking from the nose glass with which you can hardly aim. The head-on was safe precisely because head-on a bomber is toothless, and this machine had been built for the express purpose of killing that rule. Its whole meaning, its whole ferocious logic lay in one thing. The place that was empty on all the others was crammed full of barrels on this one. He came in head-on, and head-on there looked back at him not a harmless glass nose, but a blind steel plate with 8 holes. At the very distance from which he was used to opening fire himself, that plate flared all at once. Before him rose the very wall he had not believed in, orange, dense, flowing straight into his face. And on converging courses, at a closing speed near 1,000 an hour, he did not have even the half-second the novice had. He had nothing. The lightness that had saved this machine in combat for a year and a half now turned against it. The Zero was built without armor and without protected tanks. Everything had been sacrificed for agility and range. What a heavy American fighter would have survived meant the end for a Zero. The nose volley ran clean through it. Engine, tank, cockpit, all at once. The machine of the most seasoned ace did not trail smoke handsomely, did not go into a long dive. It simply broke apart in the air before the eyes of the flight he had led here to school the young. To down a recruit is an ordinary line in a report. To bring down an ace with hundreds of sorties and dozens of victories is a blow that makes a whole formation flinch. Every such pilot cost Japan years of training that by 1943 there was no longer anywhere to find. America stamped out both machines and crews on a conveyor belt. Japan did not. Every lost ace was a hole there was nothing to patch. And here one of the best had just flown into the nose of a bomber that, by his firm conviction, did not exist. The survivors of his flight did not go to avenge him. They had seen enough. They turned and carried home not a victory but a story. No longer a staff tale now, but what they had seen with their own eyes. The fairy tale of the machine with the solid nose stopped being a fairy tale at the exact second the best of them stopped being in the sky. And the low green bomber turned toward the convoy and pressed on toward its true target as if nothing had happened at all. And now, the whole truth, with nothing dressed up. Because anyone who tells you only about the wall of fire and the falling aces is leaving something out. This machine had a reverse side, and it was heavy. Heavy in the literal sense. 8 heavy barrels in the nose, plus the side packs on the flanks, are not a couple of extra parts. They are hundreds of kilograms of metal in the place where a normal bomber had 1 man with his sight. Add the belts to the barrels. Each gun needed its own rounds. And a .50 caliber cartridge weighs something over 100 grams. Thousands of such rounds in boxes. All told, the conversion added close to a ton to the nose of the machine, perhaps more. And that ton hung not just anywhere, but at the very forward-most point. Every aircraft is balanced around a certain point, the center of gravity. Shift the load forward, and the machine starts to drop its nose, grows heavy in turns, obeys worse at low speeds, behaves more dangerously on the landing approach. The pilots of these strafers had to relearn how to fly the machine because the old Mitchell and this converted rhinoceros behaved differently in the air. A piloting error right at the water, down on the deck, was not forgiven. Each one has a takeoff weight limit, and if you have hung nearly a ton of barrels and rounds, then nearly a ton of something else has had to come off. They took off bombs. The Mitchell, conceived to carry a solid bomb load, in the strafer version took noticeably less aboard. The logic was iron. This machine no longer rained bombs from altitude across wide areas. It worked point blank, and its main weapon became the barrels, not the bomb bay. But the fact stands. The firepower was paid for in carrying capacity. Extra weight is extra consumption. To drag that ton of iron, the engines burned more fuel on the same routes. And in the Pacific, where the run to the target and back sometimes stretched hundreds upon hundreds of kilometers over empty water, every extra gallon counted. Commanders figured the radius of action with a pencil in hand, and the converted machine lost out in those sums against an ordinary one. What was forgiven over Europe, with its nearby airfields, over the ocean could cost a crew everything. 8 barrels firing in long bursts grow red hot. The metal does not have time to cool. In the cramped nose compartment, where all of it hammered at once, the temperature shot up until the compartment became a glowing box. A very real danger arose. Rounds in the belts, lying against the hot metal, could ignite on their own, without any shot fired. Ventilation had to be worked out, the heat drawn off, the firing order calculated so the barrels could catch at least a little rest. The gunner could not simply lean on the trigger forever. He risked a fire half a meter from his own face. When 8 heavy barrels strike at once, what shoves backward is no toy force. It is a tangible blow to the whole machine. Down on the deck, right at the water, that volley genuinely set the aircraft's speed back, braked it a little at the most critical moment of the run. The pilot had to keep it in mind. Fire a long burst, and the machine sinks, and there is even less left to the waves beneath the belly. At masthead height, any such nuance became a question not of comfort, but of the crew's survival. 8 barrels working in unison are 8 sources of trouble. Different barrels fired at slightly different rates, and that unevenness bred a vibration that over time loosened the mounts. A jammed round in one gun was an ordinary thing, and in the heat of battle the gunner could not always clear it. The mechanics on the ground fussed over these noses like capricious animals, cleaning, checking, adjusting the convergence point of the streams, inspecting every belt for a bent or faulty round. The machine was more complex, more temperamental, and more demanding than an ordinary bomber in everything to do with servicing. Yes, it took fewer bombs. Yes, it burned more fuel. Yes, it was temperamental, ran hot, braked from its own volley, and demanded twice the fuss on the ground. Every one of these drawbacks was real, and none of those who flew it would argue, but all of it paled before one simple fact. Not a single enemy pilot wanted to find himself in front of its nose. For all the shortcomings of this machine, engineers, mechanics, and cargo manifests paid. And for a meeting with its barrels, the enemy paid, and paid incomparably more. Until now, the talk has been of separate clashes. One Japanese pilot, another Japanese pilot, one downed ace. But a war is not won by single skirmishes, and the real turning point came not when the first fighter fell, but when the low machines with the solid noses fell upon a convoy all at once. The Japanese were running a large convoy to New Guinea, 8 transports, 8 escort ships, thousands of soldiers aboard, and everything needed to hold the front at lay. The movement was vital. Japanese command counted on getting it through under cover of weather and of fighters from Rabaul. On paper, the plan looked sensible. On the water, everything went otherwise. American and Australian aircraft fell upon the convoy over the Bismarck Sea. And for the first time in a major battle, those very low-flying strafers with the barrel-stuffed noses went into action, together with a new bombing tactic. Not from altitude, but point blank, skipping the bomb across the water into the hull. While the high-flying machines and the fighters tied up the escort, the low ones came in right over the water, straight at the transports, shearing the decks with fire and driving bombs into the flanks from a distance at which it was nearly impossible to miss. Of the 8 transports, all 8 went to the bottom. Of the 8 escort ships, half, 4 destroyers, were lost as well. Thousands of men moving up as reinforcements never reached the front. In a single battle, Japan lost an entire convoy with everything it carried. This was not a line in a report about a downed fighter. This was the wrecking of an operation of strategic scale, and in that wrecking, the low machines with the blind noses played one of the leading parts. When one aircraft is lost, it is written off to chance. When a whole convoy goes to the bottom, conclusions are drawn at the very top. And Japanese command drew a simple, hard conclusion. To run large, slow convoys along this route by day, under the blows of low-flying machines, was to make a gift of them to the enemy. The old scheme of supply by sea in this area was effectively struck out by a single battle. Large convoys of slow transports through the dangerous straits were no longer sent. Supply was shifted more and more onto fast destroyers, which slipped through by night under cover of darkness, and onto submarines. Such night express runs carried many times less than a proper transport, and the garrisons on the islands began to starve in the most literal sense. The low machines did not merely sink ships. They cut the very artery by which Japan fed its distant garrisons. Before, escorting a convoy had been routine. Circle over the ships, drive off the high-altitude bombers, and all is under control. Now, over the water, a new predator had appeared, one that did not rain bombs from above across wide areas, but flew in point blank and shot up everything on deck, and into the bargain sheared off anyone who tried to come at it head-on. The fighter, used to being the hunter, found itself more and more in the role of the one being warned. Be careful. Do not go head-on at those low ones. Their nose is a solid wall of fire. They ceased to be merely bombers that had to be nursed along. They themselves became the thing around which the attack was built. Over their own fleet and their own strike groups, they moved like guard dogs, driving off enemy fighters, clearing the way, shielding those working alongside. The machine that the designers had sketched as a modest medium bomber turned into the master of the battle down at the water. The rumor of the low machines with the blind noses went from crew to crew, from island to island, growing in detail. Some told of a wall of fire that the most seasoned pilot flew into and did not come out of. Others of a convoy that went to the bottom entire. Others still of how supply was now carried by night on destroyers, because by day there was no passage over the water. And by the summer of '43, these scattered stories came together into one common firm knowledge across the whole theater. A machine had appeared that a meeting with over the water was best avoided. The personal story of a single battle had become the acknowledged threat of an entire campaign. The islands changed, the faces in the cockpits changed, the targets on the water changed. One thing did not change. Whoever underestimated the low machine with the solid nose paid for it in a matter of seconds. The machine had strayed from its own, dragging along on one good engine, trailing smoke. A classic victim. The Japanese went in as he always had, high and from the side, onto the straggler. He fell short by the barest margin. The gunner swung the nose to meet him, and 8 barrels struck at once. The fighter was punched through along its whole length, from engine to tail. What a second ago had been an aircraft turned into a cloud of aluminum debris, drifting slowly down toward the water. The pilot had time for nothing. On one of the strafers, above the gun mount, someone had scrawled a short line by hand. "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." It was not bravado for show. It was a precise description of what happened to anyone who flew into the convergence cone of 8 barrels at 300 meters. The line faced forward, into that very point in the air, and every Japanese coming in head-on flew, in the literal sense, straight at those words. Normally a ship is the hunter of aircraft. Anti-aircraft guns, dense fire, a wall of bursts across the attacker's path. But the strafer had been built precisely to overturn even that. A flight of low machines came at the destroyer from different directions, right at the water, and the first thing it did was bring nose fire down onto the deck, onto the place where the anti-aircraft crews stood. 8,000 shots a minute swept the gunners off their pieces before the ship could properly bite back. And then, across the already deafened and bled-out deck, a bomb went into the hull. The ship, used to being a fortress, suddenly found itself an open shed under a downpour of lead. The anti-aircraft men were cut down at their guns. The bridge was punched clean through. The superstructure turned to a sieve. The low machine swept over the very mastheads, struck point blank and pulled away, leaving behind a burning deck and a bomb driven into the hull at the waterline. The thing that was meant to bring down aircraft had itself become a target, shot up from the air at point-blank range. They already understood. You cannot go head-on at a lone low machine. So you had to take it from several barrels at once, from different sides, so the gunner could not decide where to look. The idea was sound. Several fighters came at the strafer from different angles, reckoning that at least one would slip through the fire. The nose battery was not the only thing this machine had. While the 8 forward barrels held the one coming head-on, the top turret swung onto the one coming from the side, the waist guns met the next, the tail mount watched over the one trying to creep up from behind. For a few seconds the machine turned into a sphere of flying lead, spitting in every direction at once. One of the Japanese would manage to break off the attack and pull away trailing smoke. Another would not, and would add himself to that same cloud of wreckage over the water. The experienced already knew the rule and kept their distance. But the green ones were thrown into battle, and they went at the low machines the way they had been taught to come at an ordinary bomber, and learned the difference too late. One such, with a bare handful of sorties, and not a single victory yet, saw a strayed strafer and decided that here was his chance to distinguish himself. He came in too straight, too sure, with no cunning at all. The gunner waited for 300 meters and pressed the trigger. A quarter of a second was enough for the fighter to stop being a fighter. Singly, each was brief, seconds of fire, and it was over. But together they formed one and the same relentless formula. The enemy saw an unremarkable low machine. The enemy took it for prey. The enemy went into the attack with the usual confidence, and at the very moment when, by all the old rules, he should have fired first, a wall rose before him, and the rules ceased to apply. The islands and the faces changed. The ending was one. Until now, everything had gone one way. The low machine came, struck, pulled away, and what was left on the water and in the sky was the other side's wreckage. But this war had a reverse face as well. And sooner or later the wall of fire this aircraft threw out met a wall of fire rising to meet it from the ground, not in the sky. In the sky few things frightened it. The vulnerability was below, right at the target, where it was obliged to come in point blank, at masthead height, in a straight line, with no maneuver at all. It was there, on the bombing run, that not fighters but anti-aircraft guns awaited it. Shipboard automatic cannon, shore batteries, twin barrels on the decks, everything that could reach a low-flying machine struck it point blank, from a distance at which it was hard for either side to miss. The machine came in as it should, right at the water, nose onto a transport. The forward barrels were already sweeping the enemy's deck. And at that very moment, on the bombing run, when there could be no dodging, it was struck from below and the side at once. Not one tracer, dozens. The aircraft had flown into its own trap. To reach the target, it had laid itself open to dagger fire at point-blank range. The rounds raked along the belly, ripped the skin open, reached the things that hold an aircraft in the air. One engine caught fragments and began to choke. From a punctured tank, a stream of fuel trailed away. The control runs jammed. The machine yawed. it sank toward the very water, all but scooping a wave. A moment ago, it had been the hunter, shooting up the deck. An instant later, it had itself become a stricken, barely living bird over the open ocean, hundreds of kilometers from its airfield. He was no green lieutenant. He was one of those older pilots who had come to aviation back in the 20s, flown thousands of hours long before the war, and learned to feel the machine through his skin. He was older than nearly everyone in the squadron, and for that he commanded more respect than any insignia could buy. He felt the hits through his whole body, knew they were heavy, but knew something else as well. The Mitchell is a tough machine, and as long as there is one pulling engine and a piece of control left, there is a chance. One engine was failing. Fuel was leaving the punctured tank with every minute. The controls answered only halfway, and beneath the wing, only water, with home still a long, long flight away. He did not play the hero and finish the target on a second pass. He turned the dying machine onto a course for home and let it low, gently, wringing from it every extra mile it could still give. The gunner did not leave the forward barrels. If even one Japanese had dropped on them now from above, finishing a cripple would have been a matter of seconds, and the only answer left was that same wall of fire. The flight engineer fought the fuel, shutting off the punctured tank, pumping the remainder into a sound one, doing everything so that the gushing fuel would not meet the red-hot metal and turn the machine into a torch. Each man went about his work in silence because there was nothing to say. They were all counting the same thing, the miles to shore. They reached the airfield on a wing and a prayer. But the machine could no longer set down normally. The controls were shot away, one engine dead, and speed had to be kept higher than usual to keep from stalling. The pilot brought the stricken aircraft onto the strip the way no school teaches, balancing on the thrust of the single engine and the little that still answered of the controls. The machine touched down hard, at high speed, bounced, went into a skid. Something gave way. The aircraft slewed around, was dragged along in a cloud of dust and torn metal, and at last came to a stop. The crew tumbled out of the machine and ran clear, expecting the punctured tanks to blaze up at any moment. But the flight engineer's work on the fuel paid off. There was no fire. The men came through whole, every one of them. The aircraft itself, riddled, with a dead engine and broken landing gear, was no longer fit for the line and went for salvage. But it had done the main thing. It had brought home a living crew from a place from which, by every reckoning, one does not return. And this was a victory of another kind, not the one where the enemy falls into the water, but the one where your own reach the ground. By this time, the low machines with the solid noses had ceased to be mere iron. They had grown names, paintings, nicknames, and rumors, and that, by now, was a weapon mightier than any barrel, because a bullet kills one man. But fear breaks whole squadrons before anyone has pressed a trigger. Their noses and flanks were painted by hand, fiercely, with defiance. On some, war-painted Indian profiles bared their teeth. This unit went down in history under the name Air Apaches, the airborne Apaches. On others were daubed gaping jaws, predatory eyes, tongues of flame reaching back from the barrels. The paintings were not ornament. They were a warning turned forward, toward the side from which the enemy came in. The machine was still silent, and its face was already screaming at the enemy, "Run!" Beneath the cockpit, small marks were drawn, one for each thing this machine had destroyed. Silhouettes of sunk ships, symbols of downed aircraft. The rows of these marks grew from sortie to sortie, and any mechanic, any newcomer, walking up to such a machine on the hard stand, read its flank the way one reads a service record. Each mark said one thing: this machine has already sent so many to the other world, and it is ready to add more. The Japanese pilots disliked these low machines with a particular gut-deep dislike, the kind that is born of fear. A machine that comes in right at the water, shoots up decks point blank and cuts down head-on anyone who ventures near, did not fit the familiar picture of the war. They called it devilish, hellish, accursed, each in his own way, but the meaning was one. It was an admission wrung out of the enemy. That is not how one speaks of an ordinary bomber. That is how one speaks of what one truly fears. The real weapon of these machines was not the 8 barrels. The barrels were only the tool. The real weapon was the fear they instilled. By 1943, a Japanese pilot, catching sight of the low, solid nose, no longer thought about how to attack it. He thought about how to go around it. And in air combat, the one who is thinking about getting away has already half lost. Hesitation is the end. Let a fighter falter for an instant, turn away, lose its resolve, and its advantage evaporates. That is exactly what the sight of these machines did. It made the hunter hesitate in the one moment when hesitation is forbidden. The machine defeated the enemy before the shot, by the very fact of its approach. Many of them had gone to war already resigned to the role of game. They had been taught that a bomber is a target chased by fighters, that their lot was to endure, to fend off, and to pray they would reach home. And suddenly, everything turned over. From the hunted, they had become the ones from whom others flee. This reversal inside their own heads was, for the crews, no smaller an event than any sunk target. For the first time in this war, over the water, they flew not as prey. The sense of those letters came down to one thing. Before, they wrote, we feared every sortie, feared the fighters, feared the fire from the ground, feared not coming back. And then they gave us these barrels. And for the first time, the one who began to be afraid was not you, but the one sitting opposite, in the other cockpit. And that feeling, that now they dreaded us, and not we them, was worth more than any decoration. The more Japanese pilots turned aside at the sight of the low nose, the bolder the crews acted. The bolder they acted, the more targets were left burning on the water. The more burned on the water, the louder the rumor ran. And that rumor came back to the enemy as a fresh wave of fear. A machine of iron and 8 barrels had turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was feared because it won, and it won in part because it was feared. And now, all the way to the top. If we are to tell how far this machine went, then to the very limit, to records hard to believe, and to an encounter with a weapon against which, it was thought, there was no counter. It happened that a low strafer, coming in over a Japanese anchorage, left behind it within a few minutes not 1 and not 2 burning ships. The forward barrels swept the deck of the first transport. The bomb went into the hull. The machine swept on, and at once took up the next target, not slacking its pace right at the water. In a single sortie, such a crew chalked several silhouettes onto its fuselage at once. What for an ordinary bomber was the fruit of a lucky week, these machines did in one pass over the target. Command at first did not believe the reports. Several units sunk and damaged by one machine in a single pass sounded like exaggeration, like frontline boasting. But the rows of marks grew on the fuselages, real ships smoked on the water, and the returning crews described one and the same thing. Little by little, the impossible became the norm. The low machine with 8 barrels and bombs, coming in point blank, proved more effective than anything that had flown over these waters before. Such a nose gunner had a particular instinct for lead. He fired not where the target was now, but where it would be a split second later. The pilot laid the machine onto the bombing run so level that the barrels worked as if from a gun rest. When such a pair came onto a target, misses were almost unheard of. Every one of their sorties added a new line to the legend, and the enemy learned to recognize precisely these machines and to keep well clear of them. When the ordinary tactics stopped working, when the fighters no longer risked going head-on, a weapon of a different nature came into play: the ram. The kamikaze pilot did not try to outplay the strafer in a fight. He went for a trade, his own machine and his own life in exchange for an enemy aircraft or ship. Against such an opponent, the wall of fire worked differently. To bring him down was not enough. He had to be blown apart in the air before he could reach the target on a straight line, without turning. Here again, everything was decided by lead and by the density of fire. The kamikaze came straight on, without maneuvering, and in that lay not only his chance, but also his weakness. A machine flying in a straight line and not dodging was, for an experienced nose gunner, a target easier to track. The 8 barrels threw up a wall right on the attacker's course, and he flew into it at full speed. If the burst reached the engine or broke the structure in time, the ramming machine fell apart or came off its course, falling a few dozen meters short of the target. This was not the easy reckoning dealt to a green fighter at the start. The kamikaze flew to kill for certain, and the gunner had no time left for error. Half a second's delay, the lead a touch off, and the ram got through. So every such blow turned aside was not merely another mark on the fuselage. It was the saving of the machine and the crew at the very edge, in the last gap between life and wreckage. The enemy traveled the whole road, from mockery to respect, from respect to fear, from fear to desperation. At first these machines were laughed at, then they stopped being attacked head-on. Then they began to be given a wide berth, and at the last, the most extreme thing there was thrown against them, men ready to trade their own lives for the machine's fall, and even that gave no guarantee. The low machine that the designers had sketched as a modest medium bomber reached the line where against it was deployed no longer tactics, but desperation. Higher than that, there was nowhere to rise. And then the sky emptied. And in that emptiness, another, far more bitter labor began for the low machines. By 1944, by 1945, Japanese naval aviation, the very same that at the start had considered these waters its own, had been wiped out almost clean. The best pilots had died earlier still, in battles they could not win. There was no time and nothing with which to train new ones. There was simply no longer anyone to shoot down in the sky, and the wall of fire, created to fell fighters, now scarcely met any in the air. Since there was no enemy in the sky, the 8 barrels in the nose were turned downward toward the earth. Japanese garrisons on the islands, airfields, barges, trucks, depots, troop concentrations, all of this was now the target. The low machines pounded coastlines and jungles, coming in on the deck and bringing their fire down on everything that moved and did not move. The same tactic that had once sunk ships now scorched ground positions. Only there was no romance of the duel left in it now. There was heavy, dirty, dangerous work. In a fight with a fighter, seconds decided everything, and the enemy was visible. Over land, the danger was of another kind, unseen until the last instant. Everything that could fire from below struck at the low-flying machine. Anti-aircraft cannon, heavy machine guns, ordinary infantry blazing into the sky with whatever was at hand. The low approach that made the strafer invulnerable to fighters turned it, over land, into a perfect target. The lower it came, the more deadly it was itself, and the easier it was to reach in return. A heavy anti-aircraft shell that caught the machine on the bombing run left it no chance. It went into a wing, into the fuselage, into the engine bay, and tore the structure apart from within. The nose compartment, packed with barrels and rounds, became, on such a hit, a deadly trap for the man sitting there. The machine that a second ago had been hosing the ground with fire could in one instant turn into a falling, disintegrating lump of metal. And it happened not in a handsome duel, but as a matter of routine, under fire from a ground no one had properly seen. Gunners and pilots who had come through dozens of sorties, who had made their machines famous, now died not in a duel with an ace, but from a stray shell loosed off the ground at random. Some did not come back at all. Some dragged themselves to their own lines, but paid for it with a leg, an arm, their sight. A young man who not long before had caught the lead like one catches a beat in music could in a single pass lose a hand and carry the war in his own body to the end of his days. Behind every mark on the fuselage, added more slowly now, stood an ever higher price. Those that had survived a year and more of battles looked worn out. The paint on their flanks was scoured down to bare metal by the rushing air and the salt spray. Rows of patches ran across the skin, the traces of old punctures, welded and painted over any old howe. Engines that had run hundreds of hours at the limit pulled unevenly, ran hot, demanded constant fussing. The proud nose paintings had faded and flaked away. These aircraft still flew and still struck, but in every one of their sorties could be read the weariness of metal that had reached its edge. The old eagerness was gone. There was no experienced, worthy enemy in the sky against whom one wished to prove oneself. There was the routine of ground strikes, losses to unseen anti-aircraft fire, and the long, draining wait for the end. The crews counted the sorties left the way one counts the days to release. Many had spent more than a year at the front, flown 50, 60 missions, outlived those they had begun with. Victory was already near and already beyond doubt, but there was little joy in that nearness. Too many were missing from the count by which it came. The machines that had overturned the rules of war over the water, that had made aces turn aside and a whole supply fleet go to the bottom, finished their road as a matter of routine. They scorched the last garrisons, caught the last fragments, lost the last men. The glory had stayed back there, in 43, in the wall of fire over the Bismarck Sea. And here, at the end, there was simply work, to the last day, while there was still someone and something to pound. And in that ordinariness, there was something more honest and more bitter than in any legend. And now, what was left of all this, once the last shot had died away? Those very low aircraft that had turned the war over the water found, after the victory, that no one needed them. The war ended, and thousands of combat machines turned overnight from weapons into a heap of expensive metal. Many strafers went straight to the breakers. Their weary, battered structures were not worth keeping. They were herded onto lots, their instruments torn out, fed under the press. The machine that the enemy's best pilots had feared ended its road beneath the blade of a scrapping crew, like an old truck. A handful of these aircraft were saved, set in museums, under a roof, on permanent display. Today, a visitor walks past such a machine, lets his eye slide over the solid nose, reads the short placard about the caliber and the number of barrels, takes a photograph and moves on. He sees a calm, polished exhibit. He almost never sees what this machine truly was: a wall of fire over the sea, decks swept clean, point blank, and enemy pilots turning aside at the mere sight of it. The idea born in a field workshop, to take a large aircraft and turn it into a flying battery firing down and forward, did not die with the war. It grew. 20 years on, over the jungles of Vietnam, true gunships rose into the sky, transport machines bristling with barrels along one flank, able to hang for hours over a single point and pour unbroken fire onto the ground. First it was a converted old transport, and then a heavy machine that became a legend of the night sky. A straight line runs from the nose packed with machine guns by the hands of an angry mechanic to these modern flying fortresses of fire. They came home, to port cities, to mining towns, to quiet streets they had left as boys for the war. Some never again went near an aircraft, and to the end of their lives said nothing of what they had seen over the water. Others flew again, in new wars now, in new skies. Others still carried the war in their own bodies, in a hand taken off, in fragments under the skin, in dreams from which one wakes in a cold sweat. Year by year there were fewer of them, and at some point there was no longer anyone beside you who remembered that wall of fire with his own eyes. Those of such pilots who were lucky enough to survive and meet old age recalled that encounter, years later, in the same way. We laughed when we first heard of them, they said. A bomber with a whole battery in its nose seemed an absurdity, the whim of rich men with too much iron and too little taste. And then the air before such a machine turned into a solid wall. It was like flying into a wall. I saw many in the sky, they said, but I never met anything like those low machines. They did not merely defend themselves, they attacked you with their defense. The gunners and pilots of these machines departed one after another, and in some year the last of those who had with his own hands held that very nose battery was gone. He lived to deep old age, to an age at which the war seemed something out of an altogether different life. At his farewell, there were spoken words left from the man himself, plain, with no grand manner at all. They gave us these barrels and said, "Defend yourselves." And we did more. We made it so that they were the ones who had to defend themselves. And every time we pressed the trigger, it was as if we wrote in the sky one and the same line. These machines are not prey any longer. There remained an idea that overturned one of the chief rules of war, that defense can be more terrible than attack, and that the prey can become the thing others flee from. There remained a handful of aircraft under museum roofs, and a straight line to the combat machines that fly over battlefields to this day. And there remained the memory of that brief time when a low, unremarkable machine right at the water made the enemy's best pilots turn aside. Thank you for being here on this journey through one of the boldest stories in the sky of that war. If it gripped you, leave a like and share it with someone who values true stories of courage and iron ingenuity. And one more thing before we part. If this story gripped you, do not leave in silence. Hit the like. That short flick of a finger says more than it seems. It shows that stories like this deserve to be told further. Subscribe to the channel if you are here for the first time. Ahead lie many more forgotten machines, daring men and closed pages of that war that the school textbooks never mention. And be sure to tap the bell so you do not miss the next episode. Otherwise, it will simply be lost among thousands of others, and you will never learn how the next incredible story ends. Write in the comments what you make of this machine and whether it was worth it. We read every word. See you in the next episode.